why was there not an emergency alert put out about this? There's no rhyme or reason why it was never done. It should have been done.
Perhaps if we received an alert about this situation, that many people might have been spared.
Really made me sick to my stomach that they didn't put the emergency alert out. If the police had put the emergency alert out, I would have got it on my phone hiding in the woods and I would have known what was going on. And it could have saved some more lives.
Hi and welcome to Power and Politics. I'm Vashi Capellos. Under pressure to explain why an emergency alert wasn't issued while a gunman ran loose through rural Nova Scotian communities. Over the course of 14 hours this weekend, RCMP now say they were just about to activate that alert as the manhunt came to an end. Here's what they had to say just last hour.
At 10:15 a.m., Nova Scotia provincial emergency management officials contacted the RCMP to offer the use of the public emergency alerting system. We were in the process of preparing an alert when the gunman was shot and killed by the RCMP.
So why didn't the RCMP activate that alert hours earlier when they first knew there was an active shooter? The CBC's Elizabeth Chu joins us now from our Halifax bureau. She was listening to that RCMP news conference. Hi, Elizabeth. So we heard from members of the community who are anxious to figure out exactly what the RCMP's reasoning was for not issuing the alert earlier. What did they have to say today?
Well, they basically said that they relied on their Nova Scotia Twitter account. They reminded the public why they did that. Now, it's important to note that the Nova Scotia Twitter account has 92,000 followers of the RCMP in a province where 970,000 people reside. Chief Superintendent Chris Leathers said this afternoon that given that dynamic and fluid situation that Mounties who are trained to respond to, they were dealing with something that Leather called unimaginable, and indeed it was. Now, Twitter, Leather defended his use of Twitter, saying that it was they were able to convey real-time information about the tragedy as it was unfolding, an account that is followed by news reporters for local, provincial, and national news organizations. And indeed, they were following those Twitter feeds and producing reports that were published by news outlets, including, of course, the CBC. Leather did confirm that Nova Scotia emergency measures officials did reach out, offering to put out an alert, but by the time the wheels were in motion, Leather said that the Mounties had actually shot and killed the gunman.
And meanwhile, you have been reporting for most of the day, Elizabeth, that dual citizens in the area actually did receive an alert. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, Vashi, not just dual citizens, U.S. citizens that actually live in Nova Scotia were getting security alerts from the U.S. Consulate General. So people in Nova Scotia, some people were getting some sort of warning. I spoke to 2 American citizens who received this alert on their phone, and the notification popped up telling them that they had an email from the U.S. Consulate General's office. They immediately read the email, and one of those people is Amy Crowley. She is a dual Canadian-American citizen living in Halifax. She immediately went to her phone. Let's hear now from Amy Crowley.
I was shocked. I was actually absolutely shocked. So I immediately went to the news to see, and there was a report about an active shooter. And I think at that point in time there was some report of him moving around. Everything sort of blends together from that morning. But I would say the email definitely prompted me to go to the news, which I might not have done on a regular Sunday morning. One would hope that if people had been more aware to stay inside, maybe some of this tragedy could have been avoided, but I don't feel we really know the extent of everything at this time.
Now, Crowley said she didn't feel immediately threatened when she received the alert because it said that the shooter was in the Portapique area, but she did immediately head to her news feeds and saw that the shooter was on the main highway heading into Halifax, and that is a city where he has 2 denture clinics. And she noted that the takedown actually happened at a truck stop just outside the city's airport. So the tragedy indeed was hitting very close to home for Crowley and so many others in the city.
All right, thanks very much for that update, Elizabeth. The CBC's Elizabeth Chu for us in Halifax. For more now on how communities in Nova Scotia are coping with this tragedy, let's bring in Karen Casey, Deputy Premier of Nova Scotia and MLA for Colchester North. That's the area that covers the community hit so hard by this crime. Hi, Ms. Casey. Good to have you with us. Thank you very much for making the time.
Thank you for having me.
I want to start off by asking how you are and how your community is doing right now.
Well, obviously, our community is devastated. Our hearts are very heavy. Certainly, the healing process is not even really started because people are trying to come to grips with the tragedy and with the disbelief that this could happen in our community. So our job is, to try to comfort and control and console, and also to help bring some hope to the community.
And what has that been like for you? My understanding is, in the midst of trying to do that, you also knew at least one of the victims, fairly well, and you knew of many others.
Well, most of the victims were my constituents. I was not related to any of them, but as an MLA for 14 years, you get to know your constituents.
And what are your thoughts today, I guess, about the loss of those lives? What can you tell our viewers about who they were?
Well, they were very much a part of the community, and they contributed to the community. We in rural Nova Scotia and in all small communities are very close-knit, fun-loving, warm, care about each other, and contribute to the community in whatever way individuals can. Those people who we've lost had made a valuable contribution to the community. And so we now will benefit from that contribution that they made. But it's sad that they're not here to continue.
The Premier was on the program the other day, and he talked about how this is such a hard thing to explain to people. And I'm wondering if you share that sentiment.
I do. It was a senseless act. It was tragic. It was something that took everybody by complete surprise. Things like this are not supposed to happen in any community, definitely not in a small rural community with a few hundred people. So it was a shock. It was tragic. It was cruel, and it has left the community broken at this time.
As members of your community try and begin to process what happened, we've heard from some of them who have expressed concern that a more widespread emergency alert wasn't issued. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think we all, we can debrief and we can look back, but I think it was obviously a concern that has been brought to my attention by my constituents. I know our Premier has been very clear about the process for that alert to happen. And unfortunately, we did not get a request from the RCMP to issue that. But why that happened or did not happen would certainly be a question for the RCMP.
The RCMP just not too long ago actually said that they were in the process, because you're right, the Premier has laid out what the process is, essentially that the lead agency has to craft the message and then it will be issued by the province. And they said that they were in the process of writing that message when the suspect was shot. Is there any cause for review by the province about why the province has to wait for that message in order to send one out? And I'm asking only because we've seen, for example, the U.S. consulate in Halifax sent out a message to dual citizens, not waiting for the RCMP to direct them to do so. Is that something the province should be reviewing?
Well, I would repeat what our Premier has already said is before you can put out an alert, you need to have some pretty clear direction and detail as to what the agency or the organization wants included in that alert. So it would be premature for any government to put out an alert unless you had the exact details and the current information that that group wanted to share. And so that's why it's important that that contact be made by, in this case, the RCMP, to let government know or let the EMO know exactly what they want and how they want it to be worded, and then our responsibility is to get it out.
I understand that point completely. I guess from the perspective of the U.S. consulate, what we heard was once they saw the tweets, they then based their alert on that. Is that something that the province should consider moving forward?
I can't answer what we will do going forward, but I know there will be certainly a debriefing as to how the information could have gotten out to my constituents and to the whole province in a more timely manner.
Does it strike you as concerning at all that the RCMP, and I'm going to couch this by saying, you know, there's a lot of things on their plate, and there was during this time. It was a very highly fluid, as they point out, and dynamic situation. But does it concern you at all that it took essentially over 12 hours from the start of this incident for them to even begin crafting a message for the province to send out an alert? Is that something you would like to see further scrutiny on?
Well, I think we all have to realize that this is a situation that is unheard of in Canada. No RCMP or law enforcement teams would ever have had to deal with something like this before. So it was certainly new territory for them. I give the RCMP full credit for the excellent service that they provide in our province. Nova Scotians have grown to trust and respect the RCMP. And none of us have any idea what situation they were finding themselves in on that particular night. So it's not for me to judge whether they did or did not do what they should. They were doing the best they could at the time.
Is it for, and I take your point again, but is it for the province not to judge at this point, but to ask?
I think we certainly want to work with the RCMP, and part of the debriefing and part of the conversation going forward will include that debriefing by the RCMP and conversation with the government about what they might have done differently, what the RCMP might have done differently. That will be very much an ongoing conversation.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you, Ms. Casey. I appreciate your time this evening, and our thoughts are with you and your entire community.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate the opportunity to hear from you and to acknowledge the condolences that are coming from all over Canada and the U.S. To this little community in Nova Scotia. Thank you very much. It's appreciated.
We're certainly all thinking of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
The Prime Minister earlier today addressed questions about whether an emergency alert should have been issued. Here's what he had to say.
I think there are many families that are grieving incredible losses right now, who are asking themselves questions about how things could have been different, how they might have been able to have been warned earlier. Those are extremely important questions that I know will be addressed through the investigation and through the conclusions. We need to make sure we're doing everything we can every step of the way to protect citizens in any circumstances. And I know those are things that we will be reflecting on and talking about as a country in the coming years, in the coming days and weeks.
RCMP now say they were in the process of getting an alert out, but then police shot and killed the suspect. Let's bring in Pierre-Yves Boudoir. He's a former deputy RCMP commissioner. My apologies. Hi, Mr. Boudoir. Nice to see you again.
Good afternoon.
Okay, let me start off with the question around the emergency alert. I'm sure you heard the RCMP address it today. They essentially said overnight they had a security perimeter secured. They did, in the morning they realized that the suspect wasn't there. When they did between 7 and 8 a.m. realize also that he was dressed as an RCMP officer, that he had the sort of mocked up cruiser. They then issued an alert on Twitter. What did you think of what you heard from the RCMP, and what do you anticipate the kinds of questions they'll be receiving on this will be?
Well, the questions have already surfaced in relation to why not using one of the tools you have in your toolbox in relation to the emergency alert. Twitter and the RCMP have clearly indicated that they have followers on Twitters, and they obviously chose to use Twitter as a vehicle to share ongoing information with regards to this particular tragedy. The problem with Twitter is in Nova Scotia, you have 970,000 people. And according to my research, there's about 100,000 Twitter accounts out of Nova Scotia. So there's a whole swath of people that are not using Twitter that would have gained from getting valuable information through an emergency alert. And if we've all experienced emergency alert, you certainly pay attention when your phone, your TV, or your radio goes off to warn you about possible threats. So hence the reason why it would have certainly benefited people in the surrounding areas to have heard of this emergency alert and the gunman that was actually going about dress and driving what appears to be a marked police vehicle.
Does it make sense to you that the process is that the RCMP has to craft the message and then the province basically issues it? And the Premier today said, well, we asked the RCMP a bunch of times, but they didn't supply that message. And what we heard from the RCMP was, as soon as they were ready to, they ended up, the suspect ended up being shot. Does that process make sense to you, or do you think it needs to be revisited?
Well, having experienced, major operations, when these things are unfolding, you have so many issues to manage, and it's a challenge at the best of times. What stands to reason, though, if you look at the fact that the province reached out to the RCMP and asked whether or not they would like to use the emergency alert, the internal protocol within the RCMP, obviously, as a result of this particular incident, needs to be revised in order to ensure that the decision is at the lowest possible level. Whereas if you need to issue an alert, someone in the emergency communication center should be in a position to actually issue the alert immediately to the benefit of the population that could be in potential dangers.
So who do you mean by that? Who should basically be able to make that decision, do you think?
The person that is actually, if you're considering the environment where you already have a number of bodies, you have a containment area, and obviously the suspect has evaded the containment area. So hence the reason why then the individual RCMP officer that gets this request or is in a position to alert the authority should have the proper authority to issue this alert, because when you're talking about people that have been killed in a particular scene, and you have the distinct impression that the scene hasn't been contained properly, then the alert should be issued.
We spoke a few days ago, Mr. Bourdois, about the breadth of the investigation, 16 crime sites that the RCMP have to look into. Today, they were asked a bit more about, what is the timeline here? How exactly did this unfold? And they didn't have a lot of answers. They said that they're still in the midst of putting it all together. Does that make sense to you, given the scope of the investigation?
Well, it makes sense considering that it's over a 90-kilometer. Basically, it's a crime scene, 90-kilometer long, with 16 different scenes per se. You have obviously professionals, and the RCMP indicated, from Nova Scotia, from New Brunswick, surrounding divisions, plus national headquarters, and the armed forces being in the mix. So they're trying to piece together what actually transpired with regards to the timeline. Chief Superintendent Leather indicated that he's looking at this and hopefully will be, in a very truncated period of time, be able to provide a clear timeline as to what has transpired. Obviously, the RCMP were also overnight between Saturday and Sunday gathering important information about the gunman, because they were in a position to actually post a picture of the actual vehicle used by the gunman to escape the dragnet that the RCMP has put up. So they did a lot of work, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done. Obviously, taking a deep dive into the online history of the gunman and how did he manage to secure the uniform, the real uniform that he had, and the vehicle, because it's really troubling that he was able to access especially uniforms. From experience, I know that on the average, you'd have about 9 or 10 uniforms that would be reported missing in the course of a year, and you'd have some uniform would be stolen. But and I'm sure that the RCMP is currently investigating whether or not some of the customers that the enterologist had might have been able to provide, or someone that he knew. So they are obviously digging deep in order to secure answers for the grieving families.
And it was also, just on that note, Mr. Bourdois, it jumped out at me that They were not able to, they didn't even know that he was in that uniform or had that cruiser. I believe what I heard in the press conference was until the morning, until they interviewed what they called a key witness. So he was able to, wreak havoc under the auspices of being a member of the law enforcement for goodness knows how long, at least hours prior to that, without anybody actually knowing.
Correct, and if I recall the chain of event, the picture was posted on Twitter fairly early on Sunday morning about this particular vehicle with this particular marking. So obviously they were backtracking overnight trying to determine. Obviously they were able to determine who the individual was, and then they were able to gather additional information that was disseminated on Twitter, but unfortunately not at the larger population through the emergency alert.
They also spoke about the fact that they thought they believed that he was acting alone, but that they were still investigating whether he had any help in the lead up to the incident. And then also they didn't believe that he was licensed to carry a firearm. Specifically what they said, we have a fairly good idea, at least in Canada, that he did not have a firearms acquisition certificate, which I think is sort of morphed into a new name now, but essentially refers to a license to carry.
Correct. But he obviously had a lot of firepower and also a accelerant, because he set up at least 5 residents on fire. And looking at some of the pictures of the vehicle, there were a couple of vehicles that were or appear to have crashed together, and they were burnt, both of them. And it appears that accelerant were also used in order to destroy some potential evidence by the gunman.
And when you talk about motive, because we have heard from a number of people there, they're concerned about the emergency alert, but they're also just at a loss for how someone would ever have the motivation to do something like this, why anyone would ever do something like this. What are investigators focused on as they try to piece together some semblance of what that motive is, taking into account that, that there's no note left, for example, and that, of course, there's no suspect to interview?
Yes, but the key piece, though, is that the initial action of the gunman was focused on the specific residence with specific individuals that were known to the gunman. So obviously, the investigators are asking questions in relation to what's happened with the gunman and why did he specifically go to this residence, and obviously wreak havoc in the Portapique residence and this area, setting different houses on fire in order to create chaos, which would allow them to escape the area when police officers would actually show up. So there's a ton of work that needs to be done, both upstream and downstream for the RCMP investigators in order to piece together a clearer picture as to what actually transpired, starting, of course, with the motive. The big questions, though, for the grieving families is, will they get answers and be able to bring about closure to their respective tragedy and the collective tragedy for Nova Scotia? And that's going to be a monumental task for the RCMP.
What do you think we should or we could expect in the coming days, as far as, for example, piecing together some sort of timeline, getting some answers on what kinds of firearms he had access to and used? All of those questions were asked today, but there were not yet answers.
Yes, because of course, and what you have to bear in mind, the Chief Superintendent Leather is dancing a delicate dance because he doesn't want to compromise any ongoing investigations. The big questions is any assistance in the lead up to from any individual. So these are all ongoing investigations, and Chief Superintendent Leather needs to provide enough information to reassure the public that things are moving in the right direction, but yet not too much information to compromise ongoing investigation, both for the RCMP and also for CERT.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you so much, Mr. Bourgeois, for your time, as always, and your insights. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.